Coming to paperback and Kindle Unlimited, Isis, All That Glitters. The goddess next door takes on a bikini-clad bank robber in this action-packed, all-new Isis series adventure. Get Isis, All That Glitters in paperback and Kindle Unlimited this March. Recently, DC Comics announced that it was cutting 7 jobs in an effort to refocus on comics publishing. Unfortunately, in its efforts to cut these jobs, they wound up firing the wrong people. Now, as I see it, if DC Comics wants to get serious about refocusing on comics publishing, then they need to fire Dan Dido, the co-publisher and president of DC Comics, Jim Lee, the co-publisher of DC Comics, Bob Harris, the senior vice president and editor, and they need to fire people like Tom King and Brian Michael Bendis. I believe if they started to fire people like this, then it would show most of the fans out here who want to buy DC Comics and have stopped buying DC Comics that DC Comics is serious about refocusing its efforts towards comics publishing and trying to make an effort to reach many of those former DC Comics fans who have been alienated by Dan Dido's over 15 years of bad business decisions. Because it was Dan Dido's bad business decisions that derailed DC Comics back as far as 2002 when he was appointed to be the editor-in-chief of DC Comics. And the reason why Dan Dido has been a complete disaster is because he is from Hollywood and the entertainment industry and knows absolutely nothing about publishing or the publishing business. So you're Dan Dido, the man who said that we needed a rape in a story like Identity Crisis and that an angry reader is an engaged reader. He is the core problem with what's wrong at DC Comics right now. Because when we look at DC Comics, it wasn't having any problems until he showed up and decided that he was going to go out of his way to find ways to alienate customers and drive them away from DC Comics and the DC Comics brand with stories like Graduation Day, where they killed Donna Troy for no reason, stories like Identity Crisis, where Sue Dibney was raped, and then we had the Justice League acting completely out of character for the time period where they said that this so-called rape happened, where we had Satana mind-wiping people and characters like Hawkman and Green Arrow and the Flash acting completely out of character. And then we go on to later stories like Infinite Crisis, Final Crisis, and then the New 52, which Dan Dido ushered in, which was a complete and utter disaster, which led to the complete derailing of the entire DC brand, from the comics, which did not sell at all, to the merchandise, which wound up rotting on shelves. Thanks to Dan Dido's complete mismanagement of the DC Comics brand, DC Comics lost all of its momentum ever since 2002, and DC Comics is now on the precipice of collapsing now that he is back in charge. Now, most comic fans thought that when Jeff Johns brought in the Rebirth story model, we were going to get it fast-tracked back to the classic DC universe. Unfortunately, Jeff Johns was let go, and then Dan Dido was put back in charge of DC Comics, and we went right back to doing stories like Your Heroes in Crisis, and we started to see things that people liked, like the Peter Tomasi Superman run. That run was derailed so they could bring in Brian Michael Bendis, and then we got stuff like Super Sons, a book that was selling, canceled. So we saw the exact same pattern from Dan Dido in 2018 that we saw back in 2002, 2003, when your Dan Dido just decided, he doesn't like Nightwing, so he just finds a way to get the Tim Drake Robin title canceled, the Nightwing title canceled, even though those books were selling. And any publishing professional will tell you, if a product is selling, you want to keep that product in print. And the reason why you want to do that is because 90% of all books fail, and you need that 10% of books that are selling to pay for the 90 that don't sell or the ones that undersell. So you definitely need titles like Nightwing and Robin to keep paying the dividends for the books that don't sell. But your Dan Dido, because he didn't like those characters and he didn't like those concepts, he wanted to cancel those books, and he wanted to do things like bring back your Hal Jordans and your Barry Allens, even though most comic fans just had moved on from those characters and had accepted Wally West as the Flash and had accepted Kyle Rayner as Green Lantern. And it was his bad business decisions that wound up alienating so many DC Comics fans and led to many people walking away from DC from 2002 all the way up until 2011. And then furthermore, people started to leave with the New 52. And the DC Comics brand has never been the same under his incompetent mismanagement and his completely incompetent leadership. Now, the second person that needed to have been terminated was your Jim Lee. Now, Jim Lee, yes, he's a great artist, and he can do some great arts, covers, and things like that, but he's just not a businessman. When we look at Jim Lee's track record, as in him bankrupting his own Wildstorm brand, he just doesn't have the skills to be a publisher. Because in order to be a publisher, you have to understand that every book that you publish has to be one has a target audience, and two, has to be able to pull a profit every month when you release that book. And your Jim Lee just doesn't understand these principles of publishing, because in order for you to have a successful house, you need to have a strong series of front list titles and a strong list of backlist titles. And thanks to both Dan Dido and Jim Lee mismanaging the DC brand, DC no longer has strong front list A titles, except with the exception of Batman, and their backlist has been completely destroyed thanks to the New 52 reboot, which didn't give anyone any more incentive to go out here and hunt down old back issues. Thanks to the New 52, the entire back issues of the DC brand have been completely eradicated, because no one needs to go back anymore thanks to this reboot and go out and go seek out old issues. And that's one of the things that led to many comic shops winding up drowning in so many bad DC comics, because thanks to that DC New 52, many comic shops were ordering books and they just wound up getting stuck with them. And then we had the convergence, and then we had the rebirth. So a lot of shops wound up getting stuck with all this old inventory, and they couldn't move these books because these reboots, when they come along, they invalidate all the old back issues, and they don't give a reader incentive to go out here and buy any more new issues. So when I look at the people who they are still working at DC, there is no hope of anything changing, because as long as you've got two people in charge who know nothing about publishing, then the DC Comics brand cannot get refocused back on comics publishing. In order for DC Comics to get refocused back on comics publishing, they need a president and publisher who has experience in publishing trade books. And the reason why you need a seasoned publishing professional who has experience in publishing trade books is because they understand what's important towards selling books to readers, because what sells books to readers is completely different than what sells movies and what sells television shows, because readers engage completely differently than they would a TV show or a movie, because a reader has to physically, one, pick up the copy of the book, and two, the story has to be compelling enough for the reader to continue picking up that book in the face of all of these other entertainment options that readers have these days, like video games, like apps, like smartphone games, and like digital subscription services like Netflix. So you, have to give a reader an incentive to go out here and buy these comics And DC Comics has not been giving readers that incentive to go out here and buy their comics because they believe an angry reader is an engaged reader. But as a publishing professional with over 15 years under his belt, I can tell you an angry reader is an alienated reader, and an alienated reader just doesn't buy your books anymore. So if you have a publishing house, you want engaged readers, you want readers who are enthusiastic about your product, because it's those engaged and enthusiastic readers who go out here and spread the word of mouth about your products. And what Dan Dido and Jim Lee don't understand is that, if your readers aren't enthusiastic about your products, then they're not going to spend money on your products. Jeff Johns tried to get readers engaged again with Rebirth, but then DC went right back to Dan Dido's failed business model, and now they are hemorrhaging readers thanks to bad business decisions like hiring your Brian Michael Bendis to be a writer of their flagship title. Now, your Brian Michael Bendis, yes, he's a popular writer, but when we look at his sales numbers, he's just not there anymore. Yes, he was popular back in 2002, 2003, when they had the Marvel Knights Daredevil run, but something got lost along the way, and I believe right around the time he created Jessica Jones, he was starting to fall apart creatively, and when he did New Avengers, he was really showing his weaknesses as a writer, and he's just fallen completely off. And now with this Superman run, where he has completely derailed all the hard work that Peter Tomasi has done towards rebuilding the character and rebuilding the momentum, he has literally derailed Superman and sent the Superman title into a straight freefall. Now, before your Brian Michael Bendis was hired at DC, Superman was starting to have a resurgence in popularity, and his sales numbers were starting to go back up. And the book was starting to get some strong momentum. And in publishing, when you have a book with momentum, one of the things a seasoned publishing professional will tell you to do is leave that book alone, let that writer and that artist do what they're doing, and let them continue on what they're doing. Because if you have sales that are going up to the 40,000 level, then chances are, if you leave it alone and you let these guys continue to build momentum, eventually they're going to reach the 100,000 mark if you just let that book ride. And that's what a good seasoned publishing pro will tell you what to do. He'll tell you, look, if this book is selling, then you're just going to leave it alone, and you may just do some more advertising and promotion of that book, and then you let the word of mouth continue to carry the book. Because, again, it's word of mouth that allows you to build your audience, it allows you to build momentum, and it allows you to generate more sales. I remember when I first put out No Good Deed, and that book got 3,000 downloads, the first thing I did was say, it's got over 3,000 downloads of a small story, then I need to go out here and really push this book. And that's one of the things that I did with the E-Steam series is after I saw that first story do well, I started pushing it hard. And the same thing with another book I did called All About Nikki. I did a 3-episode ebook, and when I saw that ebook take off, I went out here and I just pushed that book as hard as I possibly could, and I put a second season book on the fast track. So if something is selling, you keep it going, and you keep it going until it stops selling. And when I look at Dan Dido's business decisions, that he doesn't understand in publishing, if something is selling, again, you leave it alone, and then you push it as hard as you possibly can. You just let that book sell. You leave that creative team alone, and you let that book sell, because as long as that book is selling, it's bringing money into the business, and you can use that money to cover the losses of books that don't sell, like the ones in the Vertigo line, like your Border Town, your Goddess Mode, and your Hex Wives. A complete and utter disaster that whole Vertigo line is, and you need books like Superman and Super Sons in order to cover those losses. And when I look at his decision to put everything on Bendis and have Super Sons canceled, that was one of the most incompetent things I've ever seen, ever since what he did with Robin and Nightwing. Again, two books that were selling. And again, in publishing, when you have books that are selling, you do not touch them. You leave those creative teams alone, and if those books are selling, you push them hard, and then you let the word of mouth carry those books so that they can build a larger audience. But your Dan Dido, again, because he's not a publishing professional, doesn't understand this, and he killed those books' momentum in the hopes of getting big sales with Brian Michael Bendis, the man who hasn't been able to sell books since New Avengers and had just come off a disastrous Iron Man run. When you look at Brian Michael Bendis' Iron Man, it was just a complete and utter disaster of a run. Because this man could not write good Iron Man stories, he decides to go and bring in Riri Williams to cover for his lack of ability to work with the Tony Stark character, his lack of understanding of Tony Stark's history, his lack of understanding regarding Tony Stark's rogues gallery, and his lack of understanding of Tony Stark as a character. Because he didn't understand how to make Iron Man work, he decides to go and bring in Riri Williams as a substitute to overcompensate for his lack of doing research, and then he creates this Ironheart character who has been completely reviled by comic fans all over the world, a character who's basically an avatar for his daughter, but that's not what Marvel had paid for, and if Marvel's editors had any backbone or stones, they would have called your Brian Michael Bendis into their office, and they would have let him know, look, we're paying you for Tony Stark stories, and if you want to do this Riri Williams crap, that's not what we're paying for. We're going to have to release you from your contract. And that would have been the end of it, because in the trade publishing world, when you are hired to do a job, you are hired to do a job that meets the standard. And that's the big problem with DC and Marvel right now, is that there are no standards as related to storytelling, no standards as related to craft. And a lot of these creators, they are running roughshod over people and just doing whatever they please without editorial coming in to check them. And they're not checking people because none of these people have publishing experience, and they don't understand how their decisions have impact not only the characters of their comics, but how they also affect their brands overall. And the DC Comics brand has been damaged by Dan Dido's poor business decisions, because it was part of his poor business decisions that led to the DC Universe Classics line, I believe, not really getting any momentum, because DC Comics, they thought, oh, Green Lantern is so popular from the Jeff Johns era that they wanted to invest heavily into this Rainbow Lantern thing, and that wave completely collapsed. And it collapsed because they were trying to sell 250,000 Rainbow Lantern characters from 3 years past in, I think, about 2010 or so. And those characters, people hated them, and they hated the whole idea of Rainbow Lanterns, because Green Lantern, yes, it was popular in the comic book world, but it wasn't in the real world. And the New 52, yes, it was like maligned by comic fans, but when they tried to merchandise New 52, it didn't sell either. So his decisions have damaged the DC Comics brand. And when he went out here and does not check writers like again, Brian Michael Bendis, and hypes him up, it doesn't really help, because Brian Michael Bendis just hasn't brought the sales, and now he's driving readers away. Just like your Tom King right now is starting to drive readers away from the Batman title, because Batman for a long time was a top-selling title. It was sold over 100,000 copies, which in today's comic market is considered, a top number. But 20 years ago, Batman was selling at least 500,000 units. But I look at it today, and Tom King is destroying that Batman comic with his beta male storytelling, his inability to pay off a story, and his lack of craft as related to storytelling. And that's another thing a good publishing professional will do, is, again, take a guy like Tom King in and have a talk with him and say, look, the way you're writing this character, one, is completely out of character for Bruce Wayne. to the way you are writing these stories is just not really giving the reader what they want in a story, because when you set up a premise, you have to pay that premise off at the end of the story arc, and you have to pay that premise off with an exclamation point. And when I look at Tom King's Batman with that 50th issue, he paid it off, but he didn't pay it off in a way that was satisfying to the reader with that exclamation point. What he did was he set up this big wedding, and then he paid it off by slapping the reader in the face, by not delivering on the goods. And then with this Mr. Miracle, he sets up this big story, and then he pays it off with a period instead of an exclamation point. Now, in comic books and wrestling, you have to understand one thing. When you set up a story and you build that rising action, you have to pay off with an exclamation point. You need a big finish for a comic book story or a wrestling story. So you need to have that big finish, because it's that big finish that has the reader coming back for more and anticipating the next issue, or after they finish that issue or that story arc, getting ready to go back for back issues. So if you end on a period, what that does is it makes it where the reader has no reason to come back, and it has no reason to care. And that's the big problem with your Tom King. And when I look at his stories, he's looking like someone who is running out of steam for me. And if he couldn't get it together after 3 or 4 issues, I would have to let him go, because I'm looking at the stuff that he's producing, your Mr. Miracles, your Batmans, and your Heroes in Crisis, which is a complete disaster of an event. And this is a guy who I believe just needs to be let go, because he just doesn't have the ability to run the marathon as a writer. He doesn't have the ability to understand what payoff is, because, again, if you're writing, you have to understand you just can't set stakes and then give somebody a weak finish. People want to see a big finish. They want to see something big come out of it. They want a big climax. They want an exclamation point. They want, like Jim Ross says, a "by God" moment. They want something big. So when you are doing comics, you cannot think small. And when I look at a lot of guys like your Bendis, like your Tom King, they think too small for comics. Comics are supposed to be big, larger than life, spectacular. And that's what people want in a superhero comic. And DC Comics, sadly, they are not really, as I see it, in a place where they are able to focus on comics publishing, because they have the wrong people running DC Comics. Yes, they cut 7 jobs, but they cut the wrong people. If you cut Dan Dido, you cut Jim Lee, you cut your Brian Michael Bendis, you cut your Tom King, you cut your Bob Harris, you're going to be able to make DC Comics competitive again. And if you hire a seasoned a trade publishing pro who has a love for comics, then guess what? You're going to get that passion, you're going to get that heart, and they're going to bring energy back to the DC Comics offices. They're going to bring enthusiasm back to the comics offices, and they're going to bring a love for the characters to those DC Comics offices. Because when I look at your Dan Dido, a man who says that he hates Nightwing, he hates legacy characters, I'm sorry, you're in the wrong business, because when it comes down to DC Comics is legacy characters. DC Comics has always been legacy characters. And the reason why it's been legacy characters is because that's entrenched in the history. All you have to do is go back to the 70s with the Huntress, which is Helena Wayne on Earth 2, the kids of the Infinity Inc., like Jade and Obsidian. That's always been a part of the DC Comics history. Robin becoming Nightwing was an organic product of DC Comics legacy. Jack Knight becoming Starman was a part of DC Comics legacy. Wally West becoming the Flash and then surpassing his mentor, that was a part of DC Comics legacy. Mr. Terrific is a legacy character. All those characters, if you have an issue with them, then you have an issue with the whole concept of DC Comics, because DC Comics has always been about passing the torch. I mean, we saw Jay Garrick passing the torch to Barry Allen. We saw Alan Scott passing the torch to Hal Jordan. And the big problem is, your Dan Dido, because he's, again, like many people who are in comics today, they fear their own mortality. They get upset when these characters who they grow up with have to pass the baton onto the next generation of characters, which were my generation, the Gen X generation, with characters like Wally West, with characters like Kyle Rayner, with characters like Jack Knight. Those characters, again, they were an organic progression, but because these guys feared their own mortality, they had a problem with it, and that's what's derailed DC Comics. And they're sitting there talking about refocusing on comics publishing, but you can't refocus on comics publishing until you get somebody who is focused on publishing, someone who does publishing full-time, someone who understands the business of trade publishing, someone who understands the business of writing, someone who understands the craft of writing, and someone who understands those crafts well enough that they will impose standards and make sure that these characters remain consistent and make efforts to try to reach new audiences of readers, not only in print media, but in digital media, and understands both marketplaces. Because when it comes down to DC Comics, I don't see them as being in a place that is competitive right now, because they're going out here, and again, they're hiring writers like your Brian Michael Bendis, your Tom King, your Kelly Sue DeConnick, your G. Willow Wilson, and these people, again, they're just not qualified to write DC Comics as I see it. They just don't meet the standard for storytelling. They want to turn DC Comics into this place of identity politics, when it relates to your Kelly Sue DeConnicks and your G. Willow Wilsons, or they're just not there as storytellers like your Tom King and your Brian Michael Bendis. So you can't get refocused on publishing if you have an inexperienced publisher, person with no publishing skills, and writers who just aren't ready for prime time. So if DC Comics wants to get really serious, again, they have to fire the right people and hire fire the wrong people that they've hired and hire the right people. And right now, I don't see them going out of their efforts to hire the right people, because I see a lot of those right people out there on social media, a lot of great artists, a lot of great writers, a lot of people who are seasoned in their craft, but they still can't get in the door at a place like DC Comics. And because they can't, I look at DC and I see another DC implosion getting ready to happen, and I'm starting to see it right now with the cancellation of books like Titans and many other books. And I see that DC implosion getting ready to happen, and I don't see DC recovering this time from this implosion, because as it stands right now, they just don't have the right people leading the brand, and until they get the right people to lead the brand is going to sink. And as I see it right now, the DC Comics brand, it can't refocus because it has no leader, and without a leader, the brand is going to pretty much collapse sooner rather than later, because unless there is something done at editorial at the top where they bring in that seasoned publishing professional, I don't see a DC brand lasting another 2 or 3 years. If you'd like to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. And if you want to try some of my SJS Direct publications, like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, the John Haynes series, the Temptation of John Haynes, and the Spinster Rebel trilogy, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.